Head üliõpilased, lugupeetud kolleegid, sõbrad. Tere tulemast teisele loengule sarjast innovatsioon ja digitaalreaalsus, mis saabub meile 6. septembril sellel aastal 2022. Siis on nimelt selle nimeline konverents ja selle konverentsi ettevalmistamiseks nii meile kui teile kui kõigile oleme me teinud mõningad loengud, mis vaatavad erinevatest vaatenurkadest, erinevatest perspektiividest innovatsiooni ja kavandamiskesksete distsipliinide peale. Ja tänane esinemine on inglise keeles, see kantakse üle EKTV-s ja sellest saavad ka podcastid, mis tulevad avaldamisele Arhitektide Liidu kodulehel. See on ühine projekt meil Arhitektide Liiduga. Good evening, dear colleagues, students, Adrià. We are here today to look at the presentation of Adrià Carbonell. I've been working with Adrià for several years. I know him as an exquisite researcher. He's also Catalan architect, has been working in urban matters and architecture for a long time. And for a couple of last years, we've been teaching history of urban planning and history of urban matters together when he's talking about the more modern theories and histories of urban planning and urban design. This lecture is one of many in the series that we have started. It started last year in November with Professor Dr. Kadri Ukrainski's lectures on the general information and theory as well as practice of innovation. And today we have a possibility to look at innovation from the viewpoint of architecture and urban planning. It's not even urban design, I suspect. But these lectures are to introduce the international conference that we are going to have in September the 6th, if everything works this year, and it is called Innovation and Digital Reality. We believe that design-based disciplines have really something to say, as well as in creativity, as well as in innovation. And therefore we have started these lectures. And just before we go forward, I took out some dates just to remind myself and you what has happened around that date when Barcelona was planned, to have a kind of very short background to what is happening. So let us remind ourselves that 1812, the first railway in Leeds for transporting coal was started. 1822, Darlington train, the first steam engine locomotive, was already used. 1851, the first railway in Russia, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and after that, actually in 69, it arrived to Tallinn. 1868, Baltic railway station. But if we look at UK development, this is what happened 1837, it was started. And 1869, UK was covered with railway network, which was very dense. And that is the result of the first industrial revolution, or we might say, if we think other revolutions on top of it, the first technological revolution. It took almost 100 years for the engines, for the methods, for the hardware to develop. And 1930s to 1950s, actually the second technological revolution arrived. And then, of course, now we are facing the third one. It is believed that there is also the fourth one, but I'm not sure in it, as there hasn't been a kind of quality change. We are talking about the Industry 4.0 and other things, but actually the digital revolution that many of us consider the third technological revolution hasn't reached or really developed to a certain extent. And then just to go through with these new retooling and new materials, most of it was cast iron and steel after that. Suddenly, in the same, nearly the same decade, the urban planning started. So the Industrial Revolution, or the first technological revolution, really brought forward possibilities for these large-scale plans to be developed. And in 1855, it was Serda's project. In 1850 to 1870, it was Eugène Haussmann in Paris. 1898, Ebenezer Howard Garden City. 1902, Washington, D.C. City Beautiful. And 1901 to 1918, gradually developed une cité industrielle. So all of these planning formations actually happened in a very short period. Started with changes in the society that most probably were catalyzed by the first technological revolution. And as Serda is one of the most important characters and protagonists here, I'm really interested to hear and listen what Adrià can tell us about it. And without further ado, Adrià, you are most welcome. Please join welcoming me, Adrià. I'm glad we have so many people today here. Please.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So hi everyone. Yeah, great to be here again and to see some familiar faces. So very thankful for the invitation and to be part of this yet another program Yuri is putting together. So basically, when we were discussing what this lecture could be about, we kind of decided that we'll try to talk about innovation, but not actually in a contemporary innovation, but in an historical, or looking at an historical case. So how can we learn or how can we scrutinize an actually foundational or pioneering project in urban planning from the lenses of innovation? So what elements, innovative elements, were in the work that I'm going to present today, Ildefons Serda's plan for Barcelona. And then I think that besides the interest in the project itself, I think there are great learnings that we can actually take back to contemporary challenges or current debates around the urban condition or many other challenges we have ahead. So it will be a case of historical innovation, disciplinary and theoretical from the discipline of urban planning, but also spilling over to other fields like from social sciences to architecture, and yeah, hopefully you find it interesting. It will most probably be 2 lectures since it was actually growing, the topic. So we decided to split in 2, and then the title you see in the screen would be the title for the 2 lecture kind of pack, which today is not going to be addressing more explicitly the question of nature posed in the title Al Natural or Contra Naturam, and we'll be focusing more in the subtitle, the emergence of modern urban planning or urbanism in Barcelona. And but still, I think it's worth explaining, or with a brief note, what the title aims to mean or aims to provoke, which is a kind of tension between different understandings of nature, which actually I would argue have continued until today, and that are at the very origin of different traditions of urban planning or urban design as well. And this will cover it up in the following talk. But changing, even opposing, or you could say contradictory understandings of nature that have shaped very different also understandings of urban planning, urban design. And ultimately, I could even argue, have triggered the split between what became urban planning on the one hand and urban design on the other one. So Al Natural or Contra Naturam would somehow pose this tension between what's natural or what would be a natural way of practicing and designing against an anti-natural way of designing or planning or building cities. All right. Cities begin in the mind. All right, that's not a very good beginning because there's a typo. So it should say cities begin in the mind, not being in the mind. They're also in the mind, but they begin in the mind. Or so it was argued by Elias Canetti, the philosopher, when even going back to the origins of the Paleolithic times, he was wondering if hunter-gatherer groups of humans would already envision large populations or large crowds that would ultimately, gather and live together in a much bigger entities or spaces, we would call it today. David Graeber and David Wengrow, we just published a book which tried to, as you see in the title, try to question the whole history of humanity that we have learned so far. Also pay or give imagination an extremely important role in the whole of the development of human history. They also claim cities existed in human imagination before they were ever created and are born from the imagination, even before technological means or technological transformations or even disciplinary possibilities or fields. There is a moment where a non-existing world or a non-existing reality is imagined or is projected, which precedes the actual development or the reality to come. And we could say that this is pretty much what Ildefonso Cerdà did. Cerdà was an engineer living in the mid or in the 19th century, which from Barcelona, and he was living in a city that would resemble more or less something you see in the picture now. It was a development of a medieval town, walled, so very compact, very cramped, very insalubrious, so kind of filthy, with hygienic conditions not being very up to date, and clearly demarcated or separated from the outdoor, you could say, the outer space of the city. A city which was defined, as all of the cities were at the time, was defined in opposition to what was outside, to the countryside, or the agricultural fields, or the territory, or the rural space, right? The city and countryside opposition was extremely clear. The boundaries were very set to the point that the perimeter of the city was actually built, erected with a wall, right? Was circumscribed with a wall. And out of this city, Cerdà imagined a whole new, even though his project was called Project of Reform and Expansion of Barcelona, which is what you see on the right, actually what he did, arguably, was to imagine and establish a whole new city. A whole new way of living, you could claim, in which the former historical or medieval or even Roman town becomes just one part of it, one element within this new paradigm or new model that he would develop. And there is a kind of also visionary moment in this kind of conception of this new city. Also, if we very quickly go through a kind of genealogy or history of plans and projects for Barcelona, we see all kinds of imaginary projections, you could say projects, plans that try to alter, modify, reconstruct, reimagine the city according to new styles, new trends, new beliefs. And that's why I was arguing at the beginning that you could issues that started at that very moment in the mid 19th century, 19th century, actually have moved or have been extended or prolonged up until today, right? Questions of scale, disciplinary tensions between fragment and the whole, questions of expansion or distribution, questions of urban equality, questions of access, questions of relation between city and nature. All of those have really been addressed throughout the not only 19th but also 20th and 21st century, right? And we will actually end up with a pretty recent example that yet again goes back to the same issues, right? But we are not here to just do a bit of a Barcelona history. I mean, it's a Barcelona history, but just very much focused in one single project. But just to say that, questions I'm going to be discussing or introducing have been rethought or picked up again by, from the modern functionalist movement to the postmodern architects and planners to the more contemporary kind of ecological urbanism approach, right? So, while looking back at this moment, it's seen as a very transformative moment, and Yuri was referring to the invention of the railway, new modes of transport that radically altered not only the space of the city, but also the surrounding spaces of the city, all of the hinterlands of the urban regions, and even the connections between regions. So that gave rise to what some have called an urban society or an urban era, that would kind of overcome a previous one. And this is where a distinction has emerged between what we usually call city and what we now may refer to as urban, as different things, right? For instance, François Chouet, a French urban historian, argues that, or she makes the point in distinguishing between city and urban, the latter, so urban, designating as the indissoluble unity of the physical networks of transportation and communication and the human behaviors engendered by their use. She calls this new civilization, which is rapidly conquering our planet, the civilization of the urban, and this was written already in the 80s or so. So François Chouet already makes a point. She's been also studying Cerdà and makes a point that goes really back to the essence of Cerdà's work, which is the relation between an urban system and circulation, or modes of circulations and flows, to the point that this movement really affects and determines how people live, basically, or determines all of the social relations unfolding in an urban setting or in a city. I would approach Cerdà's work is extremely vast, difficult to cover in just one session. Today I would just focus on three aspects, which I think are extremely innovative. So to relate it back to the question of innovation, really innovative in his work. First and foremost, the foundation of a new discipline. So Cerdà is arguably you could say the founder of modern urbanism, the first that established the basis of what modern urbanism would be. And the first one in elaborating and writing a general theory of urbanization. He actually coined the term urbanization. He made it up. Second, a multi-scalar urban territorial system. So he developed not only a plan, but actually not only an urban plan, but actually an urban territorial system, which operates at many different scales. And he engaged in all of these different scales that go from the scale of the building and the plot, to the urban management, to the infrastructure, to the territorial and the regional expansion. And a third one, a new understanding of nature, of what nature is and what nature is, and also a new way of using nature as a concept, as a concept that legitimizes one's position or plan. So quickly to get a bit of an introduction of the character, Ildefons Cerdà, engineer, Catalan engineer, which as Yuri was pointing out, was kind of fascinated also in this sense of revelation when first he encountered a railway, and that happened in France. And at that very moment, kind of he envisioned he was struck by the power behind this new mode of transport, and he kind of visioned that the whole civilization will be born after that, right? That invention, that the railway network system would completely transform, European civilizations, and ultimately he believed in a kind of universal world, all connected through transport networks. But then most importantly, he thought that, as he says here, the battlefield where these old and new civilizations we actually struggle would be the cities. So cities would be the place in which kind of these tensions or these new forces actually would find their way, or as they called it, the field of operations. As a response to this, he actually started working in his, let's say, spare time, like without a commission or something like that. He started to work in what ultimately became the general theory of urbanization. And he defines urbanization, a new term that he invented, as the set of principles, doctrines, and rules that should be applied so that buildings and their conglomerations, as opposed to constricting, distorting, and corrupting the physical, moral, and intellectual faculties of social humans, can help promote their development and vitally thereby improving individual well-being, the sum total of which constitutes public prosperity. As you see, a kind of a reformist spirit and kind of extremely optimistic in the goodwill of humanity. So also, in a bit of a, let's say, extreme summary of what this work may be, we could break it down into 5 points. General theory of urbanization, which you see on the left-hand side, is actually an unfinished work composed of 3 volumes at least, 2 volumes finished only. The first one, including the theory, spanning over more than 1,000 pages, and the second one that we'll see in a minute, also completed by him, dedicated to empirical data or empirical statistics. So for Cerdà, the new theory of planning or urban planning, or as he called it, urbanization, required 5 bases: an economic one, a legal basis, an administrative basis, a political basis, and a technical basis, which is actually the plan, what we usually look at or refer to as an urban plan, right? The drawing or the layout. And all of these 5, according to him, were necessary to actually make possible the kind of vision he had, right? He was a pioneer also in using statistics, charts, or empirical data. He conducted field work. For instance, he carried out the first working class housing survey of the conditions of living conditions of the working class in Barcelona in a series of extremely complete and detailed data gathering that also he included in here, with the aim to actually understand what the real life conditions were at the time, right? And in order to, so you can imagine a 600 pages volume, all looking like that on the right. And this, as you may imagine already, denotates a strong belief in emerging social sciences, right? Or in science as a foundation of urban planning, opposite to more artistic approaches coming from previous times. As he explicitly claimed, the century of the designers, which I kind of roughly translated for designers, you could say a mix between planners and designers, is gone. That candid era in which any idea or theory with a laudable aim was happily accepted without examining if it contained any element leading to its realization. In our essentially practical century, after listening to the explanation of a thought, we immediately request and examine the possibility of its immediate application and the necessary resources. If it does not bring such auxiliaries, we reject it. So this points to a very important aspect of his work. Even though he developed a theory, the general theory of urbanization was always an intended theory of practice. So it's a theory to be applied, right? Or like someone said, there's nothing more practical than a theory, right? And all of his work, as you have seen in the second volume, in this extreme and ambitious kind of collection of empirical data, statistical work, and so on, and as you will see later on, was all aimed at actually making possible, making realizable, making real his theories or visions or plans, right? It was not only an idea, it was an idea that required to be developed and applied. And there will be more images and plans in a minute, so it's not going to be all text. But I think there are a couple of last quotes that I think, in order to understand, the frame of the thinking at the time of his thinking, and his position towards specifically nature and science. It was the moment also with natural sciences are kind of emerging. A couple of references. On the one hand, and somehow connected also to the previous reference to railways, science and art, with their marvelous achievements, have conquered nature and obliterated distance, giving locomotion the speed of the wind and news transmissions that of lighting. So extremely positivist approach to technological advancements that, as he believed, would transform the world, not only the cities, but the entire world, in terms of circulation, physical circulation, but also circulation of information, right? It's the moment also where new media are also kind of being spread, and news and circulation and information kind of speed up. On the other hand, a reference to how he understood nature. We could offer great benefits to humanity when, having discovered them through constant research and having studied and understood them, we could properly apply the principles which nature dictates, natural reason demonstrates, and which natural law proclaims for instilling order and coherence and harmony among such heterogeneous and often contradictory elements. So for Cerdà, and as opposed to a more kind of pastoral or naturalistic, you could say, approach to nature, nature was mathematical. Nature was, he understood nature as the laws of nature, kind of an abstraction of laws that would lead to perfection, and a moment that could be pursued and achieved, right? Nature is not something to contemplate, something external to humanity, something kind of a romantic idea of nature, but with something to be conquered, something to be pursued, to go after, right? And it goes, kind of is entrenched in the Enlightenment ideas of natural laws, natural systems, and so on and so forth. But also the way to get there is through constant research, through empirical observation and critical analysis and theorization of that observation. So his work actually precedes what for a very long time was considered to be the first urban planning book or treatise, which is Reinhard Bausmeister, The City's Expansion, which is here on the right, which was actually published in 1876. And for a bunch of reasons we cannot really go now, the work of Cerdà was for a long time kind of not known or not disseminated. And also preceded for a few decades the extremely influential work by Camillo Sitti, the Austrian urban planner and theoretician, that published his work in 1889, How to Design cities according to artistic principles, showing an entirely different approach to urban planning, an entirely different approach to nature and to science. This will probably covered in the following lecture. So if according to Cite, which was inspired by the antiquity and classic cities and the Renaissance, medieval and Renaissance cities, the way to go about planning was to looking at these relations between objects, architectural objects, and their surrounding spaces, kind of creating picturesque patterns, irregular networks, expansion and contraction, monumentality, representation of spaces. And the city was actually the addition of all of these unique spaces. For Cerdà was the complete opposite. Approaches, just to give you a very brief history of how the project came about. The city of Barcelona actually launched a competition for the expansion of the city, which actually won the project you see on the screen now, a project by Antoni Rovira i Trias, that, as you see, follows a kind of, you could say, more of a Baroque or kind of neoclassical style or language, with a radial structure, a series of boulevards, a kind of very central square meeting the old medieval historical core, and then growing, in this concentric form or in radial form, right? Against the winning entry and against the will of the municipality of Barcelona, the Madrid government imposed Cerdà's plan, also for a long history that I cannot explain now. But at the time, Cerdà's project was very much challenged, very much questioned, and very much criticized. As you see on a vignette published on the time, the drawing of Cerdà with these kind of very long mustaches. How you say this? Well, this tool you use for drawing circles, a compass. And the vignette goes, the autocratic power of the, and Sanchez is the expansion plan, expansion czar, bringing the excellences of the compass to the measurements of the pavement tiles. So there is a critique both for being an authoritarian plan and also for being extremely kind of scientific based, or based on measures and distances, and basically in numbers instead of in artistic principles. Right? Other entries for the competition are those you see in the picture, just also to see a bit of a comparison between the zeitgeist or the historical moment and what other architects or planners were actually designing, and the proposal by Cerdà. All of them kind of much more geometrically expressive, all of them much more contained. And Cerdà, if you remember, ultimately proposed a regular orthogonal grid, which, as I call it, would be endless or unlimited, that you could, keep, expand or replicate, even though that was used a bit of in a metaphorical sense, right? Prior to the layout of this plan, Cerdà actually carried out a survey of the entire territorial region, or of the plain of Barcelona. He himself actually developed this survey in order to have a very detailed plan or map of topographical conditions, slope conditions, existing paths and ways, and existing constructions, in order to later on fit his ultimate plan. And just going back to this former reference to the foundation of new city. Actually, if you look at this plan, and the more you kind of understand it, the more you realize that this is not only an expansion of the city, as perhaps the former projects like the one on the right clearly is, or the actual winning entry clearly is as well, is a project that somehow expands an existing structure. So that what it does, and here resides one of the really powerful or significant kind of inventions, is that he creates a system which is autonomous and which is independent from the historical heritage, let's say. An autonomous system that adapts and that is very flexible, and when it's required, you know, it's adapted, or it's transformed, or is modified, but it's actually is a self-referencing system. Sometimes Cerdà's plan is accused also of being extremely repetitive, or even kind of very boring, very homogeneous. But actually, if you look close at different successive versions that he was developing, within this regularity of the grid, there is actually a lot of nuance and a lot of sub-hierarchies that give different refinements or nuances to the plan. For instance, in this version here, you start seeing, besides all of the green areas scattered around the city, you see also some ones that have a dot in the middle, which meaning that are kind of either civic programs, you could say, or public programs like markets, or like religious churches and so on. And even though the overall structure follows a kind of a very a regular and orthogonal grid, is based on a logic that actually grows or stems from a very small detail and expands into the bigger picture, or even a successive development, also already showing a bit of a variety within the layout, a variety of the urban block structure, and also a distribution of the public services all across the layout. And this is actually an extremely important point for Cerdà. All of his theory was based on a paradigm of justice. So if we had to reduce his vision into one single point, that would be probably that of equality of access, right? Almost all of the decisions that he, even though we may call them scientific or whatever, but all of the decisions he took or undertook were driven by the aim of providing equal living conditions for every single inhabitant of the city, right? And as you see already in these kind of sub-centers, or what has been called a distributive centrality, so kind of instead of going against the logic of center and periphery of that most cities have, he kind of proposed a distributive or distributed idea of centrality, where this urban centrality was all distributed equally all across the metropolitan area. Some of the critiques of the kind of more Beaux-Arts, you could say, or the Camilo Siete followers, in a way, right? Looking at this proposal by Cerdà and claiming that this is one of the biggest horrors in the world, because it doesn't have any other organization than the juxtaposition of elements. So very strong critique, but extremely important architect at the time, Josep Puig i Cadafalch, also a city councillor and a very important cultural figure, claiming that actually there is nothing else that one block next to the other, but there is no design, right? So there's also this tension between architects as artist designers and planners as rational engineers, right? And another critique by Puig i Cadafalch, because Cerdà's, according to him, Cerdà's plan was based on a sacred democracy and holy equality that had nothing to do with a much more complicated reality. So again, a very strong, harsh critique towards this idea of equal distribution or kind of democratic equality. All right, I'm just going to skip some parts to make it short. But how all this started? What it seems, by looking at the general layout, the superimposition of a grid actually stems from a very thorough and quite rigorous historical study that Cerdà engaged even prior to the development of the plan. And that was at the origin also of the invention of the new term urbanization he coined, right? And that was the Roman city or the Roman town, so-called urbs, the urbs, right? So he believed that the use of city that referred to civitas and the Greek kind of historical city was not able to capture what he was trying to propose or what he was trying to develop. And then throughout his historical terminological kind of research, he went back to the notion of urbs, the Roman urbs, right? Which sometimes is referred to as the material aspect of the city, the material expression of the city, but that actually in reality designates a triad: the material, the legal, and the symbolic configuration of a city, right? If you kind of remember more or less how the foundation of a new of a new Roman urbe, of a new Roman town was established, was essentially, also this would be an entire new lecture that probably Yuri has given at some point, but essentially it consisted in the foundation of a crossroad, right? The center of the city was the intersection of the two main roads, the Cardus and the Comanus, that divided the city into 4 fragments, right? And the city from that point expanded to the walled area, which actually contained the limits of the city, right? These two, and I think this is important because we'll pick it up later on. Besides being the center of the city or establishing the foundational point of the city, these two axes expand beyond into territorial paths as well. And so when many times the Roman urbe is referred to as being squared, quadrata, from Latin quadrata, actually sometimes it's misread, or there are different interpretations here, but one interpretation would read that the Roman town is square, quadrata meaning a square, right? But as you see in the picture, it's not really square. The other interpretation, which is the one Joseph Rigver puts forward, and that I would argue Cerdà also follows, is that it's quadrata because it divides the city into 4 quadrants, so into 4 parts, right? Establishes the 4 parts of the city. Therefore, claiming a kind of, or underpinning a kind of a ritual moment of foundation at this very intersection. That would be a very long, side lecture as well. If you look closely at the plan of Cerdà, actually you can find also this foundational crossroads, or this foundational intersection of the 2 axes, north-south axis, that established first the development parallel to the coast, and then the foundation of a new kind of city center from which all of the other system is implemented. And he picks also on a kind of more symbolic references from the cross, the Roman cross and the St. Andrew's cross, to actually establish another crossroad point that somehow determines the whole, establishes the whole gravitation of the system within the plane. from these four main axes, the rest of the system is somehow settled or somehow grounded in the terrain. But there is also another use of this symbolism or this symbolic foundation of the crossroads or of the intersection that Cerdà takes as the very foundational element of his new urbe or his new city, which is the intersection of the road. So it's not only that the intersection establishes a kind of territorial settlement or point of gravitation, but also that his whole system is based on an intersection, which goes back to the idea of new modes of transport and circulation. So a main aspect of the new urbe would be the clear and easy circulation of its inhabitants. After kind of a careful study of the new modes of transport, Cerdà concluded that the best corner or intersection would be a round one, a radius one, which would follow kind of the turn in a crossroad. But since a curved corner would not be suitable for building, he kind of chamfered it in order to facilitate this turn. At the same time, this chamfered corner allows to turn just a corner into a space, a kind of plaza, a space that he thought or that he believed would be kind of little distributed plazas in every single corner where interaction and kind of social life would happen or would unfold. So this is actually contrary, this is also open for interpretation, but contrary to what is often thought, which is that the main unit or the main module of Cerdà's plan is the urban block, the square. This reading would actually situate the crossroads as the main module or unit from which the whole system grows. Further research and work on geometrical work on this by researchers from the School of Barcelona also have done quite thorough geometrical analysis of Cerdà's plan and coming out with these three main geometrical figures which are behind all of the plan. So which with these three elements basically Cerdà built the entire plan of the city, right? So the negative space of the intersection, this little plaza, which would be an like 8 sides octagon, you say. The street, the rectangular street, and the urban block, which would be the big piece on the right, which he actually called interway, right? So for him, the urban system was a system of ways, system of streets, and the urban block would be the space, the remaining space between ways or between streets, right? He put incredible attention into resolving, analyzing, researching, and designing the space of the street, the infrastructural space, you could say. As I was earlier mentioning, the turning radius, the crossroads, the series of urban furniture you see on the bottom that would somehow trigger social encounter in these corners, but also the design of the pavements, the division of the square, of the street that he determined as 20 meters for all of the single streets, at least in the entire city. And also the design not only of the pavements, of the sidewalks, but also the designs of a series of tree lines that would round up all of the blocks, right? As far as I know, is the first urban plan that includes the setting or the design or the inclusion of trees all across the city already from the planning system. All right. So you get a bit of a picture of how this something that may look quite similar to what he envisioned. A picture of early 19th century where you can see the chamfered, partially open urban block and the crossroads where different modes of transport meet, the alignment of the street lines, of the tree lines planted, and how this chamfer becomes a kind of a meeting point sort of square. Another aspect which was essential and fundamental for Serdar was actually infrastructural systems. He dedicated huge amount of time and energy to actually research and ultimately propose an entire new infrastructural system that for him was kind of the blood of the urban system of the city, right? Hygiene was an essential point. Sewage systems, water supply, and later on what would be, electricity supply and so on, were essential parts of this system that would allow the city to grow. Modern infrastructural networks of sewage that not only were planned and built prior to the housing expansion or to the architectural expansion, but that would also link to the entire, as you see the picture on the map on the bottom, developed by one of his not pupils but followers, you could say, a whole infrastructural system of sewage and irrigation that spanned or that connected the urban system with the larger regional territorial plan. So as he himself put it, his purpose was not to express the materiality of the city, not only the materiality of the city, but rather the manner and system that these groups follow in forming, these kind of urban groups follow in forming, and how all the elements that constitute them are organized and then function. That is to say, that in addition to materiality, I needed to express the organism, the life, if I may call it such, which animates the material part. So for Serdar, this kind of life, this kind of organism was all connected to the public infrastructure of the city, to the street network, the street infrastructures, sidewalks, and so on. And just for you to have a bit of a reference of the urban space created, this is the first recording of this expansion plan in coming up from one of the main arteries, one of the main boulevards, going up north to the hill. And I think was interesting because besides the the very generous space and the kind of very wide streets, now that it reaches the end and it points toward one of the old settlements, you can see the difference in from the new city. I'm gonna move forward here, entering kind of an old fabric to a kind of much more crowded, even though kind of expanded street. Okay. All right. So another aspect that that developed in his theory was plot subdivision management. So how to make basically what we may call or we may see the foundation of urban management. So how to redistribute urban property or urban land equally among different owners, big owners, small owners, rich owners, poor owners, right? And he kind of studied all of the different cases in which the imposition of the new city with all property structure may happen, and how this redistribution would happen, right? And he kind of developed a whole system, not only a theory, but actually a method to actually calculate costs and benefits and surplus in order for everyone to actually be able to develop, so that the land management or property management would not be an obstacle for the actual development. I'm going to flip a bit quickly through this. In one of the examples or possibilities for developing one of the blocks that he was commissioned for, he actually developed a much more detailed plan than the general layout. And here you see actually how he applied all of these ideas into actually 2 blocks. The subdivision, the design of the urban space, the design of the crossroads, the design of the interior yards, and the assembling of 2 urban blocks into one larger unit that somehow share the interior courtyard. Earlier I was referring to this very meticulous kind of statistical work that he was doing. The kind of insanity or the obsession, better word, that he applied into the calculations led him to actually come up with a number, a square meter per inhabitant. Every single inhabitant in the city would be allowed to, or should be able to enjoy. And that was 40 square meters of city per inhabitant, which somehow demonstrated in his kind of detailed plan. Okay, and just to enter the final stage, and also to question some of the critiques at the time, but also more recent critiques of his plan, like for being repetitive, homogeneous, and kind of boring. If you actually follow the revisions he had made after the plan had approved, like this revision of 1963, you also actually see how the urban blocks are grouped in very different patterns, or how they are, some are more dense or some are less dense, some follow different geometrical patterns. And this was actually something that irritated Serdar very much, because he wrote somewhere in an opinion editorial piece that the people criticizing his plan for being repetitive and homogeneous were complete lacking imagination, because they could never understand or imagine that an orthogonal grid could be built in endless number of different ways. And he was never intending to actually have a fully squared built city, but just to provide a structure or an organism, as I call it, that would support the life of the city, that could take, many different shapes and ways. And later studies actually have already focused a lot in these different hierarchies or different nuances within the plan that show the differences within the plan, and somehow again challenge this repetition or homogeneity of the plan, and have already applied what he left written in the development of the plan, how it may have looked Barcelona if it would have been built according to his writings or his plans. And here already see a subdivision into districts and neighborhoods, kind of more or less following the main axis that we see earlier, establishing a first hierarchy of main arteries in the city, and then providing different districts that would in turn correlate with distribution of services, distribution of centrality, market, schools, public services, and so on. So actually a kind of ideal module, or the ideal system of Serdar would be something like this. The crossroad, the urban block, the neighborhood that would be the top square, surrounded by continuous facade, with public buildings in the middle. So the red would denotate like public buildings. So the neighborhood within a district, so every 4 neighborhoods would create one district, and which would be the lower module. And in every district there would be also a market or a food supply, food distribution system, right? So it's a system that keeps growing and involves governance, management, and so on and so forth. Always with this kind of aim mentioned earlier of equal distribution of urban centrality, we could call it today, or equal distribution of public services or urban services. But also at the same time, if we apply some of the earlier examples we've seen of the variations on the urban block, we may come up with something like this. And these are just more or less variations I made based on his types or urban block types. And actually the combination or the kind of combinatorial game that you can achieve is actually endless, as was claimed, right? Not even in perimeter block kind of arrangements, but also in kind of freestanding buildings that he also considered for markets, for instance, or representative public buildings, and so on. All right. As I was earlier saying, he went through or across a number of scales, from the very small intersection of 2 streets to the street network, to the infrastructural systems, to the urban block, the Platz subdivision, to the territorial, or to the regional, to the district, to the regional, and to the territorial. So we see here how the actual plan is entrenched in systems of ways and roads that extend out in the region or out in the territory, and how the main arteries we've identified earlier, the 2 crosses, the St. George and the St. Andrew's cross, somehow expand into regional communication systems. And this also goes back to a kind of Roman tradition or to Roman practice of rationalizing the landscape, rationalizing the territory, right? Which is the I don't know in English how it's called, but I think something like centuriation might be. The centuriation was the Roman practice of rearranging the landscape into a regular orthogonal grid, right? Both for agricultural purposes, so rationalizing irrigation water systems, but also for rationalizing transport and routes, right? So improving the connections between points in the empire, basically. So here a reconstruction, an example of a Roman centuriation in Italy, and on the right a 3-model representation of the earlier centuriation of Barcelona. I haven't said, but Barcelona was established by the Romans in whatever, more than 2,000 years ago. Right, so kind of this link between the space of the city and the hinterland or the surrounding territory, it always goes back to this Roman heritage, or Roman kind of territorial system. And actually, so that did not stop there. He actually developed not only a block and a street network in a neighborhood, in a district, in a city, in a territory, and so on, but even defined or wrote a law, what he called Irrigation Law, which would eventually organize or structure a whole nation or a whole state, right? And here you see the translation into the diagram of the system he kind of envisioned. The hierarchies of settlements on the right. So from the rural, all of them like a settlement with an area of influence, you could say, or of a boundary. So the rural house and the farm area, to the urban small settlement and a municipal boundary, to the town, to the county, or province capital to the nation capital. And all of them would be kind of linked in a network that would operate how the diagram on the left shows, right? From NC, nation capital, county capital, town, village, and small settlement or farm. So according to this law, a whole restructuring of a nation or of a state would actually happen. This is a map or a plan of the so-called province of Barcelona, or the large county of Barcelona, where the city is actually this little dot, black dot here on the coast, on the shore. And even though it's not assigned, is assumed or attributed to Cerdà, also this plan where he was kind of trying to link or to kind of restructure this whole region according to this political organization, governmental kind of plan. So one of the great innovations of Cerdà, in a way, was to flip the urban design from the architecture, from the design of the object, to the plan and development of the unbuilt, let's say, of the infrastructural space, right, of this organism that would allow urban life to flourish or to happen through a process of conquering nature, through a process of retransforming or transforming nature into an urbanized system. And just to conclude, a very short note, and to link it to today, what I've been presented so far is very much a historical documentation or historical material that sets the origin of modern Barcelona, or tries to quickly show how the modern Barcelona unfolded or expanded. But actually today, and of course, maybe I didn't show that many of the current conditions of the city, or how this plan actually was properly or accurately developed or altered later on, but somehow we covered this in the second lecture, which, with more drawings. But actually today, and I think, trying to link back to innovation, one of the innovative things of Cerdà was that he kind of envisioned the actual current situation. So he envisioned the extended processes of urbanization that we have seen today, where we are living in a world of cities that's repeated a lot, where large urbanization or extensive urbanization is really expanding all throughout natural systems or natural reserves, and where cities have become huge agglomerations, right? So even though in that context, his grid plan system, which you see here on the core, is still very central, is still the very center of the metropolitan area of Barcelona, right? So if we look now at the relative impact of his plan, the part of the plan that was built in relation to the old town, and what has become today the metropolitan area, or the whatever we call it, megalopolis or whatever of Barcelona, still this plan or this grid system is structuring very much the entire region, right? Even these two cross road elements, if you can identify them on the right, are still structuring this huge regional development. And just to conclude, today actually, this last few years and nowadays, the municipality of Barcelona is yet again rethinking or picking up on Cerdà's visions and plan to carry out a new transformation of the city that would kind of launch the metropolis into this 21st century. into what has been called the super block project, which consists in grouping a series of 9 blocks into car-free areas, and with the aim to renaturalize the city, so introduce ecological boulevards or include green systems or green arteries within the existing very dense and overbuilt kind of city center, are going back to the earlier work of Cerdà and somehow claimed some of the points that I somehow mentioned or suggested earlier, right? So the multi-scalar approach, the irregularity of the orthogonal grid, the insertion of natural or green elements which were not respected in the development of the city. And they are somehow engaging into a real territorial regional system of green corridors or green wedges, where this grid really, unfolds or unpacks into even a much larger scale, right? So challenges for today would be how, again, to work or to think through different scales in order to achieve questions of equal distribution and equal access to natural conditions, reduce the pollution, which we see on the right, extremely polluted city center, so reduce car traffic and so on. So basically challenges that most major big cities are facing today, right? In order to achieve that, essentially is the bigger picture of how the city region actually performs. But then the small scale, this original kind of crossroads of Cerdà is becoming a really central element for refurbishment, for urban refurbishment, right? One of the first pilot projects implemented by the current city councilling is this car-free crossroads area, returned to its so-called original status as a plaza or as a meeting point. And the whole new pedestrianization or naturalization of the city, which now is called, human perspective or pedestrian, human scale, so on, goes back to this very origin of the, of the crossroads as a meeting point, as an essential urban space that would be replicated or reproduced, and little by little, gaining back the space of the city. And this is just to finalize an image, a visualization of a very recently completed competition launched by the municipality, also the winning entry of the competition, that is asked to rethink the Cerdà's street, like template grid, which you see is basically trying to green and to exclude completely car traffic from there. So just to finish, if we are to think how to innovate in the city, following David Harvey's, the question of what kind of city we want cannot be divorced from that of what kind of social ties, relationship to nature, lifestyles, technologies, and aesthetic values we desire. In a way, this is what Ildefonso Cerdà did 150 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for some questions. Right. Are there any questions? Okay, just until you think. I have one right away. When one looks at the Chicago plan or the drawings of Cerdà, there are no cars. If you zoom in Chicago plan, you can see horse carts and garages and all of that. So he didn't know about the car traffic, even probably couldn't imagine it yet, although the trams and the railways were there. What do you think, looking at Serdar, what is really the dimension of this fast-moving traffic we have, cars, at the moment? Is it the horse? Is it the two persons sitting beside each other? And how did the plan work so well, even with cars? It's quite amazing to go through Barcelona and see how flexible and actually quite how fluent it is.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I didn't mention actually more like technical aspects of it, but actually that was an extremely important part of his work and of his interest, the design of the coming up with the right measure and distance of the street, the right dimensioning of the street. And he believed all of the streets, again, was all based on this idea of equality. It's like all of the streets should, so eventually he came up with this 20 meters width, which all streets should have, at least. And this was basically coming from a series of elements he considered essential. So all streets should have 2 sidewalks in each side, which he dimensioned as 5 meters, because each sidewalk should have also a line of trees. So that would give you an area for walking plus an area for planting trees. That would up to 5. And then in the middle there would be a, how you say, where space for circulation? Street. In English? Street. Where the cars go. Anyway, like the
Lanes.
What?
Lanes.
Lanes, all right, yeah. So there will be the central lane. And in that central lane, he thought there should be at least space for 4 carriers or horse carriage or whatever in parallel. So that's how he dimensioned that. Actually, the width of a horse carriage is pretty similar than a car, probably. And if you put 4 in parallel, that's how he came up with the dimension of 10. So 2.5 each, total of 10 plus 5, 20. And yeah, I realized I didn't show, but there is actually a pretty beautiful detailed drawing of the pavements of the sidewalks also that he did that I forgot to include. But yeah, and for sure, even though the dimension was made out of the kind of horse transport of the time, and I think it shows in some of the sections. For sure, he was envisioning some new mode of transport. You see them. Yeah, but that's not a classical street. So the classic street. Should I have the other section? No. Sorry. Well, the classic street would not have the 2 lines of trees in the middle. Would have 5 plus 5 sidewalk plus entry, and then the 4. There is another section, but it's not here. But it's like this one on the right.
Okay. Are there more questions? Yeah, otherwise they won't listen.
Thank you, Adrià. I'm just curious to know more about the some kind of overlapping systems, because Barcelona had very strong railway system. And if you look at the pattern of happiness of Serdar, it actually seems that he didn't follow the some kind of logic of the railway at all. How you react on that some kind of provocation that there is no relations between different layers?
Yeah.
Because as Yuri mentioned as well, that the railway was like a very strong tool of the first, let's say, the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah, and he kind of included, so like you see, is there a mouse here? Yeah. So this was the main railway here, and there is a station over there. And then there is another one here, going to the like central square here. But so he kind of included that, but only partially. So one of the critiques that his plan had, and that actually required revision, was that he didn't take into account enough, the new railway system. So further developments, and actually a new competition that was launched at the turn of the century, like 1903, was asking, to resolve this system. When the city actually grew up to a level which was already a metropolis, there was a clash between the expanding city, surrounding villages, which eventually would be incorporated in this big metropolis, and new zones or functions of the industrial metropolis, like railways, stations, but also industrial areas, which were much bigger. And these two are aspects that were not well resolved. The railway transport and big, and also has how he planned them were kind of open railways. So it was through a street, and then it was an issue. So they got covered up and tunneled and so on. And then he also didn't plan for big industrial areas. So industries actually didn't follow this grid because they didn't fit, right? They needed bigger plots and so on. So you could say that, he could not anticipate that.
But basically, the industry was outside. It's quite far from the center originally. For example, the textile factory, quite far from the center.
Like in his vision, there would be already space for industries within his plan, but it didn't work. And then basically in this area here, can you see? Yeah. All of this was developed as an industrial textile zone, and then further here as well. So basically went a bit the areas that were not developed yet over the years, they were basically built with industries and so on. Yeah. But it was not until we're talking about the Chicago plan, which I think is 1909 or something?
Yeah, 1909.
Right. So this competition, 1903, which is called, this I'm going to show next lecture. It was called Connectivity Plan Competition. And it was aimed to resolve the connection between the growing central city and all of these surrounding functions and so on. And the winning entry was by a French architect, Léon Jousselet. And he, I think I'm not entirely sure, but I think for the first time in modern planning, he proposed what we now call zoning system. But he divided the city into 5 zones or so, like residential, green, and industrial, which that didn't have. Like for him, it was all. Like he was aiming to resolve everything with his system, which obviously, it's not possible. That was the more kind of functionalist separation of areas according to activities, and then the development of different patterns and sizes for different functions. But that came later, about half a century later.
Okay, any more questions? It looks there aren't any, but I'll just use the mic when I have it. Just a remark, how fascinating actually this Roman system is. In a way it started 2,000 years ago. It still makes its appearance here. And it was actually very rational. Recently I just looked at in more detail, it was cardo and decumanus, cardo meaning then the hinge or the turning point, and decumanus being the main street. It was something like 10 to 11 meters coming from the Roman feet. And then decumanus actually means the decimal system. So it was divided into through the decimal system. But actually the modular part was then that area of field that you could plow with 2 oxen. So something like 2,300 or something like that. So that is also a kind of good dimension, 2 oxen going through the landscape, making the striated system within the virgin landscape. All right, thank you very much for coming, and we'll let you know of the next lectures here. And thank you, Adrià. See you soon.